Danny Glover breaks his silence after Alzheimer's diagnosis. Part 1. For decades, Danny Glover has been remembered as a man of strength. On screen, he faced danger with the calm authority that made Roger Murtaugh one of the most recognizable characters in the Lethal Weapon franchise. Away from Hollywood, he became equally known for speaking forcefully about civil rights, workers, poverty, and injustice. But in 2026, Glover revealed that he had been confronting something far more personal, an illness capable of changing the very memories that helped shape his extraordinary life. Danny Glover publicly disclosed that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease approximately 3 years earlier. The revelation immediately changed the way many fans looked at the veteran actor. This was not a fictional role, nor another Hollywood storyline. It was a deeply personal reality that Glover and his family had already been living with privately for years. By the time the world learned about his diagnosis, Glover had turned his attention towards something more important than maintaining the image of an untouchable movie star. He wanted to speak about what was actually happening, and what he said was striking. Rather than describing his diagnosis as the end, Glover emphasized that life continues. He acknowledged that Alzheimer's is progressive and that the future may bring greater changes. His speech, movements, and memory had already slowed, according to his own account. Yet he did not present himself as someone preparing to disappear. He presented himself as someone learning how to live inside a new reality. That distinction matters. The phrase saying goodbye may sound dramatic, but Glover himself has not publicly announced a final farewell. His story is more complicated, and perhaps more emotional, than that. He is facing the possibility that pieces of the world he remembers so vividly could become increasingly difficult to access. For a man whose life contains nearly 8 decades of unforgettable experiences, that reality carries enormous weight. His daughter, Mandisa Glover, reportedly began noticing changes around 2022. There were moments when her father remained sharp, expressive, and capable of recalling experiences from decades earlier. But there were also moments when something seemed incomplete. Eventually, those changes led the family toward medical evaluation and a diagnosis in 2023. Imagine the emotional contradiction. Danny Glover could remember extraordinary chapters from a lifetime that most people could only dream of living. The sets, actors, protests, speeches, friendships, victories, disappointments, and historic encounters. Yet, everyday details could sometimes become harder to hold on to. Alzheimer's does not necessarily erase a life all at once. Its progression can involve changes in memory, thinking, and behavior over time. That uncertainty can be particularly difficult for families because moments of clarity may exist beside moments of confusion. For Glover, memory is more than personal nostalgia. Memory is his history. Born in San Francisco in 1946, Glover came of age during a period of enormous social and political transformation in the United States. Long before millions knew his face from movie screens, he was already developing the social consciousness that would define much of his adulthood. He participated in student activism and eventually built a life that moved between performance and advocacy. Hollywood gave him international fame, but celebrity never completely separated him from the political convictions he developed earlier in life. Then came acting. Glover's rise was not the conventional story of a young Hollywood hopeful becoming famous overnight. His breakthrough developed gradually, and by the 1980s, audiences were seeing a performer capable of moving between intense drama and mainstream entertainment. His appearances in films including Places in the Heart and The Color Purple demonstrated his dramatic range. Then, in 1987, everything changed when he appeared opposite Mel Gibson in Lethal Weapon. Roger Murtaugh became iconic. The character was experienced, cautious, exhausted by danger, and famously conscious of getting older. The contrast between Murtaugh and the reckless Martin Riggs became the engine of one of Hollywood's most successful buddy cop franchises. Millions of viewers grew older alongside Glover. That is part of what makes his current chapter so affecting. The actor audiences once watched joke about aging is now confronting one of aging's most feared diseases. Yet focusing only on tragedy risks, missing what Glover himself appears determined to communicate. He is still here. His family is still beside him. His history still matters. And his diagnosis does not instantly erase the person he has spent decades becoming. Glover has spoken about struggling to fully accept every aspect of Alzheimer's. That admission may be one of the most revealing parts of his story. Acceptance is rarely a single moment. It can be an ongoing process, particularly when a diagnosis involves uncertainty about how quickly circumstances may change. His daughter has also emphasized the importance of allowing him to control his own narrative. For someone who has spent much of his public life advocating for the dignity and voices of others, there is something fitting about that choice. Danny Glover is now speaking for himself while he can explain what this chapter means in his own words. So perhaps this is not a goodbye. Not yet. Perhaps it is something more meaningful. A man looking directly at an uncertain future and refusing to allow a diagnosis to define everything that remains. Because before Alzheimer's entered the story, Danny Glover had already survived struggles, disappointments, and enormous transformations that most audiences never saw. And to understand why his determination today carries so much weight, we have to return to where his story truly began, long before Hollywood knew his name. Long before Danny Glover became a Hollywood star, his life was shaped by struggle, discipline, family, and a deep awareness of the world around him. He was born on July 22, 1946, in San Francisco, California, to parents who worked for the United States Postal Service. His mother and father were also active in the NAACP, and that environment exposed Glover to questions of race, justice, equality, and dignity from an early age. Those ideas would never leave him. In fact, they would eventually become just as important to his public identity as acting itself. But Glover's early life was not defined by celebrity ambition. He did not grow up believing that Hollywood was waiting for him. He was not a child actor. He was not discovered by an agent while still in school. His path was slower, more complicated, and far less predictable. As a young man, Glover attended San Francisco State College during a period of intense political activism. The late 1960s were turbulent across America. Questions surrounding civil rights, the Vietnam War, racial inequality, and institutional power were transforming campuses across the country. Glover became part of that atmosphere. He was involved in student activism, including movements that pushed for greater representation and educational opportunities for Black students and other minority communities. These experiences shaped the way he saw power. They also gave him a voice. Years later, when Glover became wealthy and internationally famous, he did not abandon those concerns. He continued to speak publicly about social justice issues, labor rights, poverty, foreign policy, and humanitarian causes. That commitment sometimes made him controversial. But for Glover, silence was never the goal. Before acting became his profession, however, he lived a much more ordinary life. He worked in city government in San Francisco and spent years far away from movie sets. He was building a future, supporting a family, and trying to understand where he truly belonged. Then theater entered his life. Acting did not immediately arrive as a glamorous escape. It became a craft. Glover trained through theater programs and gradually developed confidence as a performer. Stage work required discipline, repetition, emotional control, and the ability to disappear inside another person's experience. Those skills would later become central to his screen presence. There was something different about Danny Glover as an actor. He did not rely on polished movie star charm. He had weight. His performances often felt grounded, lived in, and emotionally restrained. Even when he was not speaking, his face could communicate exhaustion, suspicion, fear, anger, or sadness. That quality helped him stand out. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Glover began appearing in film and television roles. His career grew gradually, but each opportunity added another layer to his reputation. Then came a series of performances that changed everything. In 1984, he appeared in Places in the Heart. The following year, he played the deeply flawed Albert in Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple. The role was difficult. Albert was not designed to be easily loved. He was cruel, controlling, and emotionally damaged. Glover had to portray a man whose behavior caused enormous pain while still suggesting the humanity underneath. It was a performance that demonstrated his willingness to play complicated characters. Hollywood noticed. But Glover's biggest transformation was still ahead. In 1987, he was cast as Los Angeles Police Detective Roger Murtaugh in Lethal Weapon. The film paired him with Mel Gibson's volatile Martin Riggs, and the chemistry between the two actors became the center of the story. Murtaugh was cautious. Riggs was reckless. Murtaugh had a family. Riggs was emotionally broken. One wanted stability. The other seemed to have nothing left to lose. The contrast worked perfectly. And suddenly, Danny Glover was not simply a respected dramatic actor. He was a global movie star. The success of Lethal Weapon led to sequels, box office success, international recognition, and a character that audiences would associate with Glover for decades. Roger Murtaugh also carried one of cinema's most famous running jokes about getting older. Again and again, the character expressed frustration about being dragged into increasingly dangerous situations at an age when he felt he should be slowing down. At the time, it was funny. Audiences laughed because Murtaugh's exhaustion was part of the charm. But decades later, those scenes carry a different emotional tone. Today, Glover is facing aging not as a fictional police officer, but as a real man dealing with a progressive neurological disease. The contrast can feel almost cruel. The actor who once entertained millions by complaining about age is now living through a chapter in which age, memory, identity, and independence have become painfully serious subjects. Yet Glover's career after Lethal Weapon proved that he was never dependent on one character. He continued acting across genres. He appeared in dramas, thrillers, comedies, independent films, and major studio productions. His career eventually stretched across decades, giving him one of the most durable screen presences of his generation. But fame also created a strange divide. Millions of people felt as if they knew Danny Glover. They knew his voice. They recognized his expressions. They remembered scenes from movies they had watched with parents, spouses, friends, or children. But very few knew the private man. They did not see every personal struggle. They did not experience the pressures behind the career. And they certainly did not know what would eventually happen inside his own family when the first signs of memory change began to appear. That chapter would come much later. For years, Glover kept moving. He worked. He traveled. He advocated. He acted. He gave interviews. He appeared at events. To the public, Danny Glover remained Danny Glover. But families often notice subtle changes before the outside world ever does. A forgotten detail. A repeated question. A pause that lasts a little too long. A familiar task that suddenly becomes less familiar. At first, such moments can be dismissed. Everyone forgets things. Everyone gets tired. Everyone grows older. But sometimes, small changes begin to form a pattern. And according to the accounts surrounding Glover's diagnosis, his family eventually realized that something more serious might be happening. For the man whose career had been built on remembering scripts, inhabiting characters, and drawing on decades of lived experience, the possibility of losing pieces of memory carried a painful irony. And the most difficult part was still ahead. Because before Danny Glover could tell the world about Alzheimer's, he and his family first had to confront the question privately. What exactly was happening to him? For families facing Alzheimer's disease, the beginning is rarely marked by one dramatic moment. More often, it starts quietly. A name disappears. An appointment slips away. A familiar story gets repeated. A question is asked twice. Then 3 times. At first, those moments can seem harmless. Aging itself can bring changes in memory, attention, and mental speed. Stress can do the same. Fatigue can make anyone forgetful. That is what makes the earliest stage so confusing. In Danny Glover's case, public accounts indicate that his family began noticing changes before the diagnosis became official. His daughter, Mandisa, has spoken about recognizing that something was different and helping move the family toward getting answers. For a family that had known Danny as intelligent, outspoken, observant, and deeply engaged with the world around him, those changes could not have been easy to process. This was a man who had spent decades working in one of the most demanding professions imaginable. Acting requires memory. Scripts. Blocking tiếp tục 754. Timing. Emotional cues. Long shooting days. Repeated takes. Interviews. Travel. Public appearances. For years, Glover had handled all of that while maintaining a career that stretched across film, television, activism, and humanitarian work. So when memory itself began becoming less reliable, the situation carried an emotional weight that went far beyond ordinary forgetfulness. Eventually, the family received an answer. Glover later revealed that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2023. But receiving a diagnosis does not automatically make everything easier. Sometimes it does the opposite. Before the diagnosis, there may still be room to hope that the changes are temporary. Afterward, uncertainty takes on a new form. The question is no longer simply, what is happening? It becomes, what happens next? That question can be terrifying. Alzheimer's is a progressive neurological disease. It can affect memory, thinking, behavior, communication, and the ability to perform everyday tasks. The course differs from person to person, and that unpredictability can make living with the condition especially difficult. For Glover, one of the most powerful elements of his public disclosure was that he did not pretend to have emotionally conquered the diagnosis. He acknowledged the difficulty of accepting it. That admission matters. Public figures are often expected to turn illness into inspiration immediately. They are expected to appear courageous, calm, grateful, fearless. But real life is rarely that clean. There can be fear, anger, confusion, denial, grief, and sometimes those emotions arrive together. Imagine what it means to spend nearly 80 years building a life filled with names, places, friendships, performances, arguments, causes, family memories, and hard-earned lessons, and then be told that the disease you now live with can interfere with your ability to access some of them. For Danny Glover, those memories are enormous. There are memories of growing up in San Francisco, memories of political activism, memories of theater, memories of walking on a movie sets before he was famous, memories of The Color Purple, memories of becoming Roger Murtaugh, memories of audiences around the world, memories of family, and memories that have nothing to do with Hollywood at all. Those private memories may be the most valuable ones. That is why his daughter's presence in this chapter of the story feels so important. When illness affects one person, the emotional consequences spread outward. Children become caregivers. Spouses become advocates. Family members begin watching closely for changes. Conversations become more deliberate. Small victories start to matter. A remembered name can become meaningful. A familiar laugh can become precious. A story told correctly may feel like a gift. But there is another side to Alzheimer's that is often overlooked. The person living with the disease is still a person. A diagnosis does not immediately erase personality. It does not instantly destroy humor. It does not eliminate dignity. And it does not give the public permission to treat someone as though their life is already over. That point is especially important in Glover's case. The dramatic temptation is obvious. A beloved actor reveals Alzheimer's. Headlines immediately begin using words like tragic, goodbye, or final chapter. Those words generate emotion, but they can also distort reality. Danny Glover has not publicly described himself as a man waiting for the end. His message has been much more grounded. Life continues. That may sound simple, but coming from someone facing Alzheimer's, it carries extraordinary force. Life continues when the diagnosis arrives. Life continues when memory changes. Life continues when family members begin helping more. Life continues when the future becomes frightening. And as long as life continues, there are still choices to make. For Glover, one of those choices was whether to tell the world. For years, he did not. His diagnosis remained within the private boundaries of his family. That privacy was understandable. A neurological diagnosis is deeply personal. Once disclosed, it becomes public property in a way that celebrities cannot fully control. Every appearance can be analyzed. Every pause can be scrutinized. Every forgotten word can become a headline. Glover knew what public life could do. He had been famous for decades. Still, eventually, he decided to speak. That decision changed the story. Instead of allowing rumors, speculation, or whispers to define what was happening, he put his own voice at the center of it. His daughter also played a crucial role in that decision. For Mandisa, the priority was not simply telling the public that her father had Alzheimer's. It was making sure that Danny Glover remained the person telling his own story. That distinction is powerful. Because when memory becomes vulnerable, control becomes even more valuable. Control over your routine. Control over your relationships. Control over your medical decisions. And control over how your life is described. Danny Glover had spent decades using his voice for people he believed were being ignored. Now, at one of the most vulnerable moments of his life, he was using that same voice for himself. But the diagnosis also forced him to look backward. And somewhere inside those memories was another painful truth. Behind the successful career, the fame, and the public confidence, Danny Glover had already endured difficult chapters long before Alzheimer's entered his life. Some of those struggles shaped the man audiences eventually came to admire. Others remained largely invisible. And to understand the emotional weight of his diagnosis today, we have to look at the private battles that existed behind the public image long before anyone began worrying about his memory. Long before Alzheimer's became part of Danny Glover's public story, his life had already been shaped by physical challenges, personal uncertainty, and the demands of building a career that never followed an easy path. One of the lesser-known chapters of his early life involved epilepsy. Glover has spoken in past interviews about experiencing seizures when he was younger. For any child or young adult, living with a condition capable of striking without warning can create fear that is difficult to explain to people who have never experienced it. There is the medical danger itself. But there is also the anticipation, the uncertainty, the question of when the next episode might come. For Glover, that experience became part of his early understanding of vulnerability. He eventually learned ways to manage the condition and has described using concentration and awareness techniques to help reduce the frequency of seizures. By adulthood, the seizures reportedly stopped. But experiences like that do not simply disappear. They can shape the way a person thinks about control, about the body, about fear, and about survival. Years later, another kind of uncertainty would enter his life. This time it would not involve sudden seizures. It would involve memory. And in some ways, the emotional pattern may have felt disturbingly familiar. A body doing something unexpected. A future that cannot be fully predicted. A need to adapt. But Glover's life between those two chapters was anything but quiet. Once his acting career accelerated, he entered a profession famous for instability. Hollywood success can appear permanent from the outside. It rarely is. Actors move from film to film without knowing whether the next opportunity will arrive. A successful role may create momentum, but one disappointing project can change an entire career. Danny Glover managed to survive that uncertainty for decades. After Lethal Weapon, he could have remained trapped inside the image of Roger Murtaugh. Instead, he kept moving. He took roles that varied dramatically in scale and tone. He appeared in major studio productions and smaller independent projects. He worked in films that were commercial and films that were political. And he maintained an identity outside Hollywood that was unusually strong for an actor of his stature. Activism was not a branding strategy for Glover. It predated his fame. That mattered. As his celebrity grew, so did his ability to draw attention to issues he cared about. He became involved with labor campaigns, humanitarian causes, racial justice, economic inequality, and international political questions. To supporters, he was a celebrity willing to use his platform. To critics, he could be outspoken or controversial. Glover seemed willing to live with that tension. He had spent his youth learning that public silence could itself be a choice. So he chose to speak. That willingness to remain politically active also meant that his career never existed inside the protected bubble many celebrities try to create. He was not only judged for performances, he was judged for positions, statements, associations, causes, and beliefs. That kind of public exposure creates pressure, but it also reveals something about Glover's personality. He was never especially interested in preserving a perfect image. That may help explain why his decision to disclose Alzheimer's feels consistent with the rest of his life. For decades, he spoke publicly about difficult realities affecting other people. Now the difficult reality was his own. Still, there was one area where Glover had every reason to be more protective. Family. His daughter, Mandisa, grew up while her father's career was expanding. She knew the man behind the recognizable voice and famous face. For fans, Danny Glover might be Roger Murtaugh. For her, he was simply her father. That difference becomes especially important when a family begins noticing cognitive changes. The public sees appearances. Family members see patterns. They know how someone usually tells a story. They notice when a routine changes. They recognize when a familiar expression suddenly carries uncertainty. They can detect differences that may be invisible to everyone else. This is why Alzheimer's can create such an emotionally complicated relationship between parent and child. A child may begin helping the person who once provided all the guidance. The roles shift gradually. At first, help may be minor. A reminder. A calendar entry. A repeated explanation. Later, depending on the progression of the disease, assistance may become more significant. That transition can be painful because both people understand what is changing. For the parent, accepting help can feel like surrendering independence. For the child, giving help can come with the realization that time is moving in a direction nobody can reverse. Yet Glover's daughter has not presented his story simply as one of decline. Her involvement has also been about dignity, about allowing him to remain involved in decisions, about letting him speak. That approach challenges the way audiences sometimes respond to celebrity illness. People hear Alzheimer's and begin emotionally writing the ending. They imagine a farewell, a final appearance, a tragic collapse. But that is not necessarily where Glover is today. His story is still unfolding. He still has memories. He still has relationships. He still has opinions. He still has a voice. And he still has the ability to decide how much of this experience he wants the world to see. That does not make the diagnosis less serious. It makes the present more important. Because one of the cruelest aspects of progressive illness is the way it changes the value of ordinary moments. Before diagnosis, a conversation can seem routine. After diagnosis, the same conversation may feel precious. Before diagnosis, remembering an old movie set may be amusing. After diagnosis, the memory itself can become something to hold on to. Before diagnosis, family photographs document the past. After diagnosis, they can become bridges to it. For a man whose public life stretches across more than half a century, there are countless bridges. Photographs with co-stars. Film posters. Awards ceremonies. Political rallies. Family gatherings. Interviews. Travel. Friends who may no longer be alive. Moments millions of people remember, even if he someday struggles to recall them himself. That is one of the painful paradoxes surrounding famous people with memory illness. The world becomes an external memory bank. Millions of strangers remember scenes from their life. They remember lines, characters, premieres, speeches. But the person who lived those moments may experience them differently as the disease progresses. Danny Glover's legacy, however, does not exist only inside his own memory. It exists in film, in family, in activism, and in the people influenced by his work. That may be why his disclosure carries a significance beyond celebrity news. He is not merely telling fans that he has Alzheimer's. He is forcing them to confront what memory means. Who are we when memories begin to change? How much of identity exists inside the mind? And how much survives in the people around us? For Danny Glover, those questions are no longer philosophical. They're personal. And as his family adjusted to the reality of the diagnosis, another difficult decision remained. How much should the world be told? Because once Glover chose to reveal the truth, there would be no taking it back. Every public appearance would be viewed through a new lens. And the moment he finally spoke openly about Alzheimer's would become one of the most vulnerable moments of his entire public life. When Danny Glover finally allowed the world to know that he was living with Alzheimer's disease, the announcement carried a different kind of weight than the usual celebrity headline. There was no movie to promote, no character to hide behind, no carefully constructed Hollywood illusion. This time, the story was about Danny Glover himself. For decades, audiences had watched him portray men under pressure. Fathers, detectives, soldiers, activists, ordinary people forced into extraordinary situations. His characters often survived because they refused to surrender when circumstances became overwhelming. Now, life had placed Glover in a situation that could not be solved by reaching the end of a script. There was no final scene in which everything returned to normal. There was only the present and an uncertain future. When news of his Alzheimer's diagnosis became public, longtime fans responded with sadness, concern, and admiration. For many people, Glover was not simply another actor from Hollywood's past. He had been part of their lives for decades. They remembered watching Lethal Weapon for the first time. They remembered his chemistry with Mel Gibson. They remembered The Color Purple. They remembered his unmistakable voice. They remembered the mixture of seriousness, frustration, humor, and warmth he could bring to a character. For younger audiences, those films may simply be classics available on a screen. For older viewers, they represent memories of another period in their own lives. That creates an unusual connection. When a beloved performer ages, audiences are often reminded that they have aged too. When that performer becomes seriously ill, the feeling can become even more personal. Danny Glover's diagnosis was not only a story about what was happening to him. For many fans, it became a reminder of parents who were getting older, grandparents who had begun forgetting things, partners who had received frightening diagnoses, or relatives already living with dementia. Suddenly, the famous man on the screen was facing something painfully ordinary. And perhaps that is why the announcement struck such an emotional nerve. Alzheimer's does not care about fame. It does not care about awards. It does not care how many people recognize your face. A lifetime of success cannot simply purchase an escape from the reality of the disease. For a celebrity, money and access may provide better medical resources and support systems than many families can obtain. But the fundamental emotional questions remain. Will I remember the people I love? Will I still recognize the places that shaped me? How much independence will I keep? How quickly will things change? Those questions do not become easier simply because someone once stood on a red carpet. Glover's family now occupies a particularly important place in his life. His daughter Mandisa has become one of the people helping the public understand what this chapter looks like without reducing her father to his diagnosis. That balance is difficult. Families want honesty, but they also want privacy. They want people to understand the seriousness of the illness. But they do not want someone they love to be treated like a tragedy while that person is still living. That tension is visible throughout Glover's story. There is heartbreak here. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. A progressive illness involving memory carries painful possibilities. Yet there is also danger in telling the story as though Danny Glover has already disappeared. He is not. The man who spent decades challenging audiences and institutions remains part of his own story. That is precisely why his decision to speak matters. It gives him agency. Instead of waiting for speculation to spread around him, Glover helped define the conversation himself. And in doing so, he reminded audiences of something easily forgotten when discussing Alzheimer's. People living with the disease are not merely patients. They are husbands, wives, parents, friends, artists, workers, neighbors, people with preferences, memories, humor, frustration, dignity, and histories that existed long before a diagnosis was placed on a medical chart. Danny Glover's history is particularly remarkable. Few actors remain culturally recognizable across so many decades. He moved through the entertainment industry without losing the deeper concerns that had shaped him before fame. Hollywood could have become the center of his identity. Instead, he repeatedly used Hollywood as a platform. That meant appearing at demonstrations and supporting causes even when doing so could attract criticism. It meant speaking about workers and inequality when audiences might have preferred celebrity entertainment. It meant refusing to separate completely the actor from the citizen. Glover's activism also reflected the world in which he had been raised. His parents had taught him that social responsibility mattered. His years in San Francisco during the civil rights era reinforced that lesson. His involvement in student movements gave him direct experience confronting institutions. Decades later, he had wealth and influence, but the fundamental instinct remained. Speak. Participate. Do not simply watch. That history makes his current vulnerability especially powerful. A man known for raising his voice is confronting a disease that may eventually make communication more difficult. A man whose career depended on remembering words is confronting a disease associated with memory loss. A man who traveled around the world advocating for human dignity is now depending on the people around him to protect his own dignity as his circumstances change. The irony is impossible to ignore. But irony does not have to mean despair. There are still conversations to have, still family moments to experience, still memories that remain, still opportunities for Glover to influence people simply by speaking honestly about what he is facing. And perhaps this is where the true importance of his disclosure begins. Celebrity diagnoses often disappear from the news cycle after several days. The headlines move on. Another story arrives. But for the person and the family, the disease does not move on. Morning arrives. Then another morning. Medication must be remembered. Appointments must be attended. Changes must be watched. Families must adapt. The reality continues long after public attention fades. Danny Glover understands something about long struggles. His activism was never built around the expectation that enormous problems would disappear overnight. Progress required persistence. Perhaps living with Alzheimer's now demands a different kind of persistence. Not fighting for an entire movement. Not confronting Hollywood. Not standing before crowds. Simply navigating one day at a time. And those days may reveal more about Danny Glover than any blockbuster ever could. Because behind the headlines, another important question remains. When the cameras disappear and the public stops watching, what does daily life actually look like for a man who knows his memory may continue changing? The answer takes us away from the movie star completely, and closer to Danny Glover, the father, the husband, and the human being facing perhaps the most personal challenge of his life. Away from premieres, interviews, and Hollywood headlines, the reality of living with Alzheimer's is often found in the smallest moments. A conversation over breakfast. A familiar face entering the room. A story from decades ago, suddenly returning with remarkable clarity. Then, perhaps minutes later, a simple detail becoming difficult to remember. For Danny Glover and the people closest to him, this is where the diagnosis becomes more than a medical term. It becomes part of everyday life. The public knows Glover through performances preserved forever on film. Audiences can return to Lethal Weapon, The Color Purple, or countless other projects whenever they choose. The young Danny Glover remains permanently visible there, confident, intense, funny, angry, energetic. Real life does not remain frozen in time. At 80, Glover is confronting a reality millions of families understand. Aging can gradually change the relationship between independence and support. That does not mean every day is defined by confusion. Alzheimer's progression differs considerably between individuals. Someone may retain older memories while struggling with recent information. There may be periods of strong recognition and conversation alongside moments when words or details become harder to retrieve. That unpredictability can be emotionally exhausting. Families learn not to measure every day against the person someone used to be. Instead, they begin adapting to the person who is present now. For Glover, family has become especially important. His daughter Mandisa has stood beside him as his diagnosis became public. Her role represents something millions of adult children quietly experience when a parent develops a progressive illness. The relationship begins to change. The person who once protected you may increasingly depend on you. The parent who once remembered every important detail may need reminders. The person who once made decisions for the family may begin relying more heavily on others. There is love in that transition, but there can also be grief. Not necessarily grief because someone has died. It is something more complicated, the emotional adjustment that comes when a person is still physically present, but certain aspects of life begin changing. Yet reducing Danny Glover's current life to sadness would tell only part of the story. He remains surrounded by the consequences of everything he built. His family, his friendships, his decades of work, his political commitments, his enormous cinematic legacy. Those things do not disappear because a diagnosis exists. If anything, they become more significant. Consider what memory means for an actor. Most people associate acting with emotion or charisma, but memory is central to the profession. Actors learn pages of dialogue. They remember where to stand. They respond to cues. They repeat complicated scenes from different angles while maintaining emotional continuity. Glover spent decades mastering those demands. He remembered characters who were nothing like him. He carried entire fictional lives inside his mind. Then the camera stopped, and he moved to another role. Another script. Another character. Another world. Over time, hundreds of scenes accumulated. But some memories extend far beyond cinema. Glover also carries the history of an extraordinary political era. He lived through the civil rights movement. He participated in student activism. He watched American society transform in ways that younger generations know primarily through photographs and history books. He saw Hollywood itself change. When Glover began working professionally, opportunities for black actors were far more restricted than they are today. He built his career in an industry where race could determine which roles were offered, how characters were written, and who was considered capable of carrying a major film. By becoming a leading man in commercially successful movies, Glover became part of that changing landscape. And he did it without abandoning his political identity. That history is important because Alzheimer's threatens memory on an individual level, while Glover's career exists as part of a much larger collective memory. Even if certain moments someday become difficult for him to retrieve, other people remember them. His daughter remembers. His colleagues remember. His audiences remember. Film remembers. That may be one of the most comforting aspects of artistic legacy. A performance can survive independently of the performer's ability to recall creating it. Roger Murtaugh will always walk onto that screen. Danny Glover will always deliver those lines. The performances do not age. They do not forget. They remain exactly as they were when cameras captured them decades ago. But the man watching those performances today is living in a different chapter. And that creates a deeply human question. What does it feel like to watch a younger version of yourself when you know your memory is changing? We cannot know exactly what Glover experiences privately. Anything beyond what he and his family have publicly shared would be speculation. But the question itself reveals why his story resonates so strongly. Almost everyone understands the fear of forgetting. A forgotten password is frustrating. A forgotten name can be embarrassing. But Alzheimer's transforms that ordinary fear into something much more serious. It raises questions about identity. Are we the collection of everything we remember? If memories fade, does part of identity fade with them? Families living with dementia often discover another answer. Identity also exists in relationships, in habits, in emotional recognition, in music, in touch, in laughter, in the way someone reacts when a familiar person enters the room. And perhaps most importantly, identity exists in the dignity other people continue to give us. That is why Mandy's determination to let her father participate in telling his own story matters. Danny Glover is not simply a subject being discussed. He is still the central figure in his own life. He can speak about what he understands. He can express what he feels. And he can remind people that a diagnosis does not immediately transform someone into a memory of who they once were. For fans, however, knowing what Glover is facing inevitably creates nostalgia. They return to the films. They remember the laughter. They remember the action scenes. They remember the familiar expression on Murtaugh's face whenever another disaster appeared. There was always another problem. Another explosion. Another impossible situation. And Murtaugh always kept going. Perhaps that is why Glover's real-life response to Alzheimer's feels strangely familiar. He is not pretending the danger does not exist. He knows the diagnosis is serious. He understands that things may change. But his public message has not been one of surrender. Life continues. 3 simple words. Yet behind them lies an entire philosophy. Continue speaking. Continue loving. Continue remembering what remains. Continue allowing others to help. Continue being present. Because eventually, every career ends. Every spotlight fades. Every person grows older. But Danny Glover's story was never only about how long he could remain on screen. It was about what he did while he was there and what his life meant beyond it. And as he looks toward an uncertain future, the final measure of his legacy may have very little to do with Hollywood success. It may instead be found in the people, causes, and generations that will remember Danny Glover, even if one day remembering them becomes harder for him. For most of Danny Glover's life, his identity was tied to movement. He moved from San Francisco classrooms into activism, from city government into theater, from theater into film, from supporting roles into international stardom, from Hollywood sets to political rallies, humanitarian causes, and public campaigns. For decades, he kept moving forward. Now, in one of the most difficult chapters of his life, the challenge is different. It is no longer about reaching the next stage. It is about preserving meaning in the stage he is already living. That may be the most important part of Danny Glover's story today. Because when people hear the word Alzheimer's, they often imagine only what may eventually be lost. Memory. Independence. Recognition. Language. But focusing entirely on loss can erase the life that still exists in the present. Glover's diagnosis is serious. There is no reason to minimize that. A progressive neurological disease carries uncertainty not only for the person diagnosed, but for everyone who loves them. Families begin thinking about questions they may never have wanted to discuss. How much help will eventually be needed? How quickly might things change? What decisions should be made while the person can still participate fully in them? What memories should be preserved? What conversations should happen now rather than later? Those questions can make every ordinary day feel more valuable. For Danny Glover, they also create an unusual contrast between private vulnerability and public permanence. His body will continue aging. His memory may continue changing. But his work is fixed. Somewhere in the world, someone can press play and instantly return to a Danny Glover from decades ago. He can be young again, strong again, running through explosions, standing beside Mel Gibson, facing Oprah Winfrey and Whoopi Goldberg in The Color Purple, delivering dialogue exactly as he did when the scene was filmed. Cinema gives actors something real life never can. It preserves them. That preservation becomes especially meaningful when memory itself is threatened. The Danny Glover of the screen cannot forget. But the real Danny Glover is more than those recordings. That distinction matters. His legacy is not simply a collection of movies. It is also the example of a performer who refused to separate success from conscience. Throughout his public life, Glover repeatedly spoke about causes that mattered to him even when doing so was not the safest career choice. He supported labor movements. He participated in humanitarian campaigns. He discussed racial inequality. He challenged political decisions. People could agree or disagree with him, but few could argue that he treated fame as nothing more than personal reward. He wanted it to mean something, and perhaps that helps explain why his decision to speak openly about Alzheimer's carries significance beyond his own health. Celebrities can bring attention to illnesses that millions of ordinary families already know intimately. When a recognizable person discusses cognitive decline openly, the disease becomes harder to keep at a comfortable distance. Suddenly, Alzheimer's has a familiar face. For some viewers, that face belongs to the detective they grew up watching. For others, it reminds them of someone in their own family. A father who began repeating stories. A mother who became confused in familiar places. A grandparent who could vividly describe something from 50 years ago, but struggled to remember what happened that morning. The emotional power of Glover's disclosure may come from that recognition. His fame makes him extraordinary. His vulnerability makes him familiar. And that may ultimately be more meaningful than any dramatic headline suggesting he is saying goodbye. Because Danny Glover has not publicly presented this moment as a farewell. There is no confirmed final speech. No dramatic announcement that his life or career has reached an immediate ending. What exists instead is something quieter. A man confronting a frightening diagnosis while continuing to live. That story does not need an invented goodbye to be powerful. The truth is already emotional enough. He knows what Alzheimer's can mean. His family knows. His fans now know. And still, there are days to live. There are people to recognize. There are conversations to have. There are photographs to look through. There are films to revisit. There are moments in which the past may suddenly become clear again. Perhaps a song brings back a memory. Perhaps a familiar voice does. Perhaps a story from childhood arrives with astonishing detail. No one outside Glover's family should pretend to know exactly what those moments look like. But their possibility is part of what makes the present worth protecting. There is another lesson here, too. Society often measures human value through productivity. What can someone still do? Can they still work? Can they still perform? Can they still speak the way they once did? Can they still maintain the same level of independence? Alzheimer's challenges that way of thinking. A person does not become less worthy because their abilities change. Danny Glover would remain Danny Glover even if he never appeared in another movie. He would remain a father, a husband, a friend, an activist, a man whose life affected millions of people. That dignity does not depend on remembering every detail. And perhaps this is where the story becomes less about tragedy and more about responsibility. For the people around someone with Alzheimer's, memory can become shared. One person may begin forgetting. Others help remember. Families repeat stories. They label photographs. They preserve recordings. They revisit familiar places. They become guardians of experiences that once belonged primarily to the individual. For a public figure like Glover, that circle of memory is enormous. Millions of people hold tiny fragments of his career. One fan remembers seeing Lethal Weapon in a theater in 1987. Another remembers watching The Color Purple with a parent. Someone else remembers hearing Glover speak at an event. A co-star remembers a conversation between takes. His family remembers the moments no camera ever captured. Together, those memories form something Alzheimer's cannot completely erase. A legacy. Danny Glover spent decades creating one without knowing how important that word might someday become. And now, as fans look at his story through the painful reality of his diagnosis, the temptation is to mourn what could eventually disappear. But perhaps the better response is to recognize what cannot. His work happened. His voice mattered. His relationships existed. His influence is real. And the people who love him do not need him to remember every chapter perfectly for those chapters to remain true. So when people ask whether Danny Glover is saying goodbye, the answer is more complicated than a dramatic headline. He is facing a serious disease. He is navigating uncertainty. He is aging. He is changing. But he is also still living. And maybe that is the message worth remembering most. Not that Danny Glover is disappearing, but that while he is here, his story is still being written. For decades, audiences watched him survive impossible situations on screen. Now there are no stunt doubles, no scripted endings, no guarantee about what comes next. Only family, memory, dignity, and the decision to keep moving forward for as long as possible. Danny Glover may one day be remembered as one of the great enduring actors of his generation. But the final chapter of his legacy may prove even more human than anything he ever performed. It may be the story of a man who looked directly at one of aging's most frightening realities and reminded the world that a diagnosis can change a life without instantly ending it. That is not goodbye. That is life continuing,